This is live from the Vatican. I'm Raymond Arroyo. A warm welcome to all of you joining us in the United States and around the world. Preparations continue at the Sistine Chapel for the conclave, and the cardinals are still vetting candidates for Pope from among their own. As the bells of St. Peter toll behind us, I want to tell you what we'll be bringing you in the next hour. A primer on the conclave, everything you need to know from the rules to the process about this extraordinary election of a new Roman pontiff. We will also introduce you to the major papabile candidates for Pope, at least the ones that keep appearing in the media lists or on the lips of many here in Rome. Joining me will be our regular conclave crew, Father Roger Landry of the Diocese of Fall River, Father Gerald Murray of the Archdiocese of New York, and our friend Robert Royal of the CatholicThing.org. We will also be answering many of your questions, and thanks for sending them. We will get to them in time. You can send any new questions you have during this hour to conclave@ewtn.com. But before we start, here's the Daily Dispatch. The Cardinals of the Church continued their pre-conclave talks on Saturday as final preparations are being made for the start of Tuesday's conclave. Firefighters climbed the precarious tile roof of the Sistine Chapel to complete the installation of the chimney. That will be the first signal that a new pope has been elected. Inside, the media toured the Sistine as the temporary wooden floor was installed, protecting the marble beneath and leveling off that uneven floor. The ballot-burning stoves are in place. The electronic jamming devices have also been installed. In the age of iPads and smartphones, the system is designed to ensure that the cardinals remain in complete seclusion. And a couple of polls to note out of the United States. A new Quinnipiac survey shows increasing support for same-sex marriage. For the first time ever, a majority among American Catholics support its legal recognition. 54% of the respondents indicated support for same-sex marriage. 38% opposed it. That's up from 49% support just 3 months ago. Overall, Catholics were more likely to support same-sex marriage than other Americans. Overall, support stood at 47% for and 43% against same-sex marriage. And a new Knights of Columbus Marist poll finds that American Catholics give Benedict XVI high marks for his pontificate. More than 3/4 of Catholics and more than 8 in 10 practicing Catholics said they had a very positive impression of Pope Benedict XVI's years as Pope. Nearly 7 in 10 Catholics said Pope Benedict had a very positive impact on their life. 13%, a real small number, saw a negative impact. The Pope's use of Twitter was also a hit, 2/3 saying they liked the idea of papal tweeting. The Marist poll was conducted earlier this week in the days following Benedict's renunciation of the papacy. When Live from the Vatican continues, we'll give you a primer on the conclave, its history, the process, and what you can expect in the week ahead, and we'll answer all your questions. More Live from the Vatican in a moment. Welcome back to Live from the Vatican. I'm Raymond Arroyo. I am very pleased to be joined by my compatriots, part of the conclave crew, Robert Royal of the Faith and Reason Institute and Father Gerald Murray of the Archdiocese of New York. Remember, you can email us your questions at conclave@ewtn.com. We will get to them all a little later. Well, gentlemen, this is where it will all begin in a matter of days. The Sistine Chapel, of course, is going to be the center of this conclave. And it's ground zero, really. And this is the room that the new Pope will stand in. And our pal, Father Roger Landry, who's really one of the best guides you'll ever find here in Rome, did a little package on the significance of the Sistine Chapel during this conclave, particularly Michelangelo's fresco of the Last Judgment. Look at this.
The brown triangular roof you see is the roof of the Sistine Chapel. It's inside the Sistine Chapel that our new Pope is going to be elected by the Cardinals. Let's enter on the inside and see what they're going to see every time they cast their ballot. They will be looking at one of the most famous paintings of all time, Michelangelo's Last Judgment, which he painted in 1538. You see Christ up there in judgment with Our Lady at his right side, almost shivering because of the ferocity of holding us to every act and every word. And the Cardinals, as they process up one by one to drop their ballot in that urn, will be saying before Almighty God, this is the one they think best is qualified to be the next Holy Father. Michelangelo actually continues to speak to the Cardinals from that great painting. And Pope Blessed John Paul II gave us words that he hoped that they would all hear from Michelangelo, those who would be united with the keys of the kingdom as they came forward before Christ at the Last Judgment. Pope Blessed John Paul II said, "The Sistine painting will then speak with the word of the Lord, 'You are Peter. To you I will give the keys of the kingdom.' Those to whom the legacy of the keys has been entrusted gather here, allowing themselves to be enfolded by the Sistine's colors, by the vision left to us by Michelangelo." So it was in August and then in October of the memorable year of the two conclaves in 1978, and so it will be again when the need arises. Michelangelo's vision must then speak to them. Conclave means a joint concern for the legacy of the keys of the kingdom. They'll find themselves between the beginning and the end, between creation and the day of judgment. A final clarity in light, the clarity of events, the clarity of consciences. It's necessary that during the conclave, Michelangelo teach. You will all see. Point to him, Michelangelo will teach. He will point him out. Let us pray for the Cardinals gathering inside that Sistine, that they will see just whom the Lord is pointing out to be his new vicar.
Well, and all of those Cardinals will be marching into the Sistine Chapel on Tuesday to begin this long-awaited conclave. Father Murray, I want to start with you. It will no doubt be a momentous moment. We will be there to anchor it. When the Cardinals file in, they take their oaths as a group, and they make their way into the Sistine. What is the significance of the room? I mean, we heard from Father Landry, but beyond that, the process here. What are we likely to see on that first moment?
The process will begin with the Cardinals having assembled in the Pauline Chapel, which is down the hall from the Sistine Chapel. There they have a prayer that begins the entry into the conclave. They will process with a choir accompanying them, singing the Litany of the Saints. And that's very important because it's reminding us that the Church is made up not only of us here on earth, but of the saints in heaven, and they're close to God. They intercede for the Cardinals. Once all of the Cardinals have arrived in the chapel, then we begin the chanting of the Veni Creator Spiritus, which is the hymn to the Holy Spirit. And that chanting of that hymn signifies their reliance on divine grace for what they're about to do. There are places assigned for the Cardinals according to order of precedence. They'll go into those places. In fact, that's what they're doing in the days leading up to the conclave, constructing all of that. And then when they're in there, everyone's in present, then the oath will be taken. The oath is administered by the Cardinal who is in charge, and then each Cardinal will specifically swear the oath.
And Bob, on that first day, the Cardinals, they have their Mass in the morning. They go to lunch at the Doma Santa Marta, with this sort of the hotel within the Vatican walls where they'll all be domiciled. And then they have one ballot on that first day. Why only one? Why only one on the first day when there are 4 ballots any other day?
I'm not exactly sure. I've got the canon lawyer who can answer that, but presumably they want to get a start right after they have their Mass, and they process over, and you get down to business. I mean, we feel like things have been going and going, and they've been very slow, but it's going to start quickly, and I have a sense that maybe it might even end quickly.
What do you think, Father?
The one ballot, it's a question I have too. I think it's that the Cardinals can get a sense of where they stand at the opening, and then they can step back and reflect and then begin the second day's balloting, which, as you mentioned, includes 2 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon.
And many people don't realize the conclave itself, that is not where politics are handled. That's not where coalitions are built. That happens out of the Sistine Chapel. That's happening now over dinners. It will happen at the lunches in between the conclave, at the dinners and the quiet time after they vote in the afternoons. That's where that happens. So it seems that first vote is really, as you said, sort of gives them a sense of who we're dealing with. The major, you'll see people get 50 votes, 20 votes, 30 votes. They only need 77 to become Pope. So they're looking for the man that's breaking away from the pack, I imagine.
I think that's what's going on, and it's wise because after the morning's Mass and then the prayers leading into the chapel, get the sense and then return home to meditate and reflect, and as you say, talk to your fellow cardinals over dinner.
Yeah. Now, the longest conclave was in 1271. It went on for 3 years. So I hope your children have seen a good lot of you, and I hope the parish enjoys having you away for a couple of years, Father. It'll be fine. Well, maybe you could even get a titular see here if it goes on for 3 years. You think it's going to be fast? Why?
Well, I think we've had a longer period than usual. Usually a pope dies, there are a few days, 8 days, 9 days of mourning and actually having the funeral, and then you go right into the conclave. Here we've really, Benedict announced on February 11th that he would be retiring on February 28th. And even though the unusualness of this resignation complicates matters and in some ways maybe makes it a little bit more difficult to choose, they've had a longer time. So I think by now, people are starting to get a sense of who they want.
But Father Jerry, have you heard, I've talked to a few of these electors, granted not half of the body, but it seems to me they really haven't coalesced around a particular candidate. They have a list and they have 2 or 3 people they like, but last time by this point we were hearing the name Ratzinger, Ratzinger, Ratzinger to everybody we spoke with. You don't really hear that consistency this time.
We don't, and remember, Cardinal Ratzinger was the dean of the College of Cardinals. Therefore, he was the head of the college. He was the prefect of the most important congregation, the Doctrine of the Faith. And as dean, he preached at the opening Mass.
Right.
He was known to be one of the closest collaborators of the Pope. So all of these factors kind of led, I think, to his name being in the forefront. You're right now. There are some wonderful candidates who have been talked about, but no one seems to be, we could say, a clear front runner.
Now, you remember when Cardinal Ratzinger got up, that's where he gave the great dictatorship of relativism line at the Mass for John Paul's funeral. It was his funeral Mass. It was such a stark moment. Everyone sort of focused on what he said, the way he said it, and so many of the cardinals told us before the conclave, they were so impressed. He would call on them by name at the general congregation and say, oh, it's Cardinal so-and-so from Nigeria. Ah, Cardinal so. He knew everyone's name. He would give a little biographical color, and they just felt at ease with him. That was more than half, I think, of sealing the deal for Cardinal Ratzinger. This time, you just don't have that central figure. And we will get later into some of the figures that we do have, but we are hearing about. But as of yet, we don't have that one man emerging just yet. Let's talk about this process, the process of voting, and how ingenious it is. You were marveling over this when we were in New York a few days ago. Why is it so ingenious?
The process is ingenious because it's designed to assure complete transparency in what's going on. You mentioned the Middle Ages, the 3-year conclave. There were a lot of outside pressures in the past. And there was a lot, let's just base motives in the past to gain control over the papal states. So you had a lot of Roman families trading for the pontificate. All the rules are put in place to guarantee that it'll be an honest vote, an open vote. For instance, when the cardinals write down the candidate they want on the piece of paper they're given, they have to fold it twice. Then they hold it up as they process up to the altar where they're going to vote. They put the folded piece of paper on a plate, which is on top of the urn. Then they flip the plate and the vote goes into the urn. Now think about it. If they placed it right into the urn, you could have suspicion they might have grabbed another vote out. Silly as that may sound to modern ears, this is what the rule is to establish. Once the vote is in and the plate is placed back on, the next cardinal comes up.
And then you have all the scrutineers, the pre-scrutineers, the infirmari. Tell us about those functions, Bob.
Well, there are other people who make sure that the number of votes are right, and they make sure that the counting is right, and there are even these infirmari who, if a cardinal is infirmo, he's not well and he can't actually walk up there, they go, and there's an elaborate process with a lock box and 3 persons, and they make sure that only 1 vote goes in. So this is really, it's about as pure direct democracy as you can get. By comparison, the American election, God only knows what happens in some of the inner cities.
No electronic balloting in the Sistine Chapel, not just yet. So it's not going to be fast, but it's efficient. No, it was interesting talking to you, because you're absolutely right. The human dimension is taken into full consideration, as these rules were no doubt developed over the ages.
As my canon law professor used to say, given the effects of original sin, these laws have been written, and that's precisely what this is. Not doubting any specific person, but making sure everyone can see that everyone else is acting correctly.
Let's talk about the motu proprio. Now, that was the bit of legislation Benedict signed just before he left office, and what it did was slightly adjust these rules of conclave, but there were some critical adjustments here. One was allowing the cardinals to change the start date of the conclave. We're already past that. We know we're starting on Tuesday the 12th. The other major change was, after 34 ballots, what happens? You still need a 2/3 majority, but what does the new law say?
Well, the law says after 34 ballots, the 2 top vote getters alone will be considered for the pontificate.
So it's a runoff between the 2.
It's a runoff between the
getters.
2, and then those 2 persons can no longer vote. So they are subtracted from the total number of electors, and they have what we call a passive voice in canon law. They sit there, and perhaps they're praying that they get it, perhaps they're praying the other guy gets it. You never know.
Yeah.
But at that point, it becomes a runoff election. Still, though, as you say, they have to get 2/3 of the vote. So you could come out with a 50-50 vote, and you have to keep going. And this will be announced each time a vote is taken, the totals are given. So if it came down to that, that would be where fervent prayers to the Holy Spirit would have to be offered, because people would have to change their mind about the candidate they were supporting.
No, it's a fascinating process. I mean, the history of it, the way it's done, the morning ballots taken, they're counted, they're stacked, they run a needle through them, and then those are burned in the morning, as morning offerings, I guess, and we see the result in the smokestack over the Sistine Chapel. Let's move to the movement to Domus Santa Marta. The cardinals will be moving to this facility. It's really not correct to call it a hotel, but it's a domicile within the walls of the Vatican. It's pretty simple. It's not an elaborate place. It's certainly not the Cavalieri Hilton or something, though that's not a bad place to stay if you're at a conclave. They will go into the Domus Santa Marta. How content are you that it will be secure, given the reports we've been seeing in the Italian media? Bob, bring us up to date.
Well, I don't want to be alarmist about this, but I'm actually very worried. Now, this is only the 2nd time in the since the conclave has moved to the Sistine Chapel that the cardinals will actually be walking back and forth behind us. The Domus Santa Marta is on the left-hand side as you're facing St. Peter's, and Sistine Chapel is on the right-hand side. Now, there doesn't seem to have been a problem in 2005.
Right.
And of course, the Vatican, the Governato, the government of the Vatican, brings in experts. The Gendarmeria, the actual Vatican police force, know how to jam signals and whatnot. But what we've been seeing in this general congregation is a virtual transcript on a day-by-day basis.
That's startling.
So it's we're happy as journalists that we know somewhat
we get a
what's
little
going
insight,
on.
but it's perilous when you consider that other secrets might be coming out.
But in terms of the actual voting, I think that there's a lot to be worried about here.
Yeah, it's very odd the way this whole thing has developed over the last few days, and watching this and the clampdown on the cardinals speaking, but meanwhile these moles are going a mile a minute, just leaking to these Italian journalists. It's got to be something that's on their minds as they begin to enter into this conclave period. What else should we be aware of in this process? Once they take the votes, once they count them, then, assuming you have a victor, and I hope it doesn't take 34 ballots, once you have a pope, he has to accept the office, correct?
Yes, actually, being voted the Pope doesn't constitute you the Pope. Accepting election, and that's what happens. The candidate who gets the sufficient number of votes to be elected Pope, he is approached and asked, do you accept the pontificate? And then, if he says yes, then they say, what name do you take? So he takes the name. If he refused to accept the election, he is not the Pope, and that ballot is no longer effective. So it's it's interesting. The Church has determined that the succession to the See of Peter occurs by a canonically valid election accepted by the man getting the sufficient number of votes.
But assuming he accepts, they then bring him into the room of tears. He faces those three cassocks and has to pick one of them. And then he comes out as the Holy Father. And then there's the act of homage. Now people hear that and go, oh, what does that mean? Explain to us.
Well, the cardinals then go up and offer their obeisance or their homage to the new Pope. And that is symbolic and actualizes their position. The College of Cardinals is the Senate of the Pope. They're his advisors. Their task now is complete. They've elected the new Pope. The Pope now assumes the government of the Church, and in doing so, the Cardinals now submit to him in this very moving ceremony. And it's quite something, because 5 minutes earlier, they were colleagues. Now they are his servants.
It's an awesome moment. I mean, you can only imagine what goes through the mind of a man accepting that, especially at this moment when there's so much, there seems to be a lot of upheaval and confusion. I guess confusion is the best term for it. Do you feel that when you, as you talk to people?
Well, I think you were right before when you said that people haven't settled on a candidate, but they've kind of settled on issues. We hear through the news reports today that one of the things that was most discussed, perhaps the most ever discussed in a general congregation, was the reform of the Curia and the reform of the actual mechanism of how does the Vatican operate. The Holy Father, to some people, seems a little bit too distant, and cardinals would like to have more access to him, and maybe bishops would like to have more direct access to him. So, yeah, there's nervousness, and any man taking on this task at this moment with difficulties around the world, and a Pope who, in an almost unprecedented move, decided that he was not up to this reform that needed to take place, you would have to, even over and above the usual responsibilities that you know are now going to be heaped on you, you've got this new moment you've got to deal with.
Well, the Curia, absolutely, as you mentioned a moment ago. The Roman Curia, the government here at the Vatican, seems to be an ongoing theme. Almost every day of these congregations, that has been dropped in there. It is no doubt the issue that's looming largest as these cardinals move into the next phase of this important moment, the conclave itself.
You know, and I would add one point too. I don't want to harp on this point too much, but the fact that somehow the existing structure has not been able to keep the secrecy of the general congregation where we would like to see it, it makes you wonder about where things are going to be going forward. So there's a lot to address here.
Well, a lot to pray about, Bob. When we return, the papabile candidates, the men who could be Pope. We'll introduce you to a few of them and answer some of your questions when Live from the Vatican continues. Stay right there. Welcome back to Live from the Vatican. I'm Raymond Arroyo. I want to show you something that has been getting some press attention. Frankly, I find it rather silly, but it helps put our next discussion in context. There are a number of gambling sites laying odds on who the next pope might be. Paddy Power and Odds Checker and other sites daily update the odds and the possibilities. Now, when you consider the cardinals who now have the best odds, it soon becomes clear these bookies haven't the faintest idea what they're talking about. They should stick to the track. The conclave is not a political campaign or a popularity contest. It is a solemn moment that each of these electors takes very seriously. That is not to say that politics has no role in the lead up to the conclave, because there is a lot of coalition building and candidate vetting going on even as we speak. But to reduce the conclave to politics or personalities are to miss the point. I say all of this as a caution as we enter into our next segment. We want to introduce you to some of the men who we've been hearing a great deal about this week here in Rome, as well as candidates that seem to top some media lists. None of this should be seen as advocating for any particular cardinal or an endorsement of any particular cardinal. We just thought you might enjoy a chance to see and hear directly from some of the men who might be Pope. Joining me on set is the entire conclave crew. Robert Royal of the Faith and Reason Institute, Father Gerald Murray of the Archdiocese of New York, and Father Roger Landry of the Fall River Diocese joins us in the flesh, not just on tape. That's nice to see. Thank you all for being here. Now to our first papabile candidate, Cardinal Mark Ouellet, the 68. Eyes are flipping. The 68-year-old is currently the prefect of the Congregation for Bishops here in Rome. He's responsible for vetting candidates for the episcopacy around the globe. A native of Quebec, Canada, he is the former primate of Canada, where he had a difficult tenure as Archbishop of Quebec City. Cardinal Ouellet speaks 6 languages, including English, French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, and German. Here is Cardinal Ouellet from an interview I conducted with him in 2005, addressing the state of the faith in Canada. Listen. What is the condition of the Church in Canada? What are you facing culturally at this point?
I mean, we face, a crisis of faith for many years. A sort of slow, withdrawal of believers that are not officially, taken a distance from the church, but that are not going to Mass on Sunday, for example. But they are still interested in having some religious formation for their children in schools. But the school system now is going towards a non-Catholic education, religious education. So, but at the same time, in our dioceses, there is a reaction of Catholics who want to really renew the Catholic education of their children. And and the bishops are, programming new forms of preparation for the sacraments. So there is a positive reaction also. So everything is not negative, if you want. So the pressure, the social pressure, is not anymore, in favor of the Christian values. And we are challenged, by the media culture. We are challenged by them. But at the same time, some Christians are really reacting and taking a new awareness of their obligations and responsibilities in that regard.
Cardinal Mark Ouellet. Now, I want to start with you, Father Landry. We were talking earlier this week, and you talked about the criteria of discernment that these cardinals might have in mind as they look for candidates. Explain that to us briefly.
I think there are basically 4 criteria that the cardinals themselves have been saying they're looking for.
In a candidate?
In a candidate for the papacy. The first is who the man is. Does he live the faith with joy? Is he prayerful? These types of things are far more important than what his race is, what his nationality is. This person's going to be the vicar of Christ and therefore needs to remind people of Jesus. The second criterion, which is one of Cardinal Ouellet's fortes, is he needs to be a polyglot. I think at a minimal level, you have to be able to speak English, Italian, Spanish, and French. And if somebody doesn't have all 4 of those languages, I think it makes him a little bit more of a long shot. The third criterion would be he's got to be physically vigorous. I'd be surprised if someone older than 72 or someone who has had lots of health scares would be a front runner. And then the fourth, I'd say, is he's got to have shown administrative competence, not just experience, because one of the issues that the cardinals really want to be addressed is the reform of the Vatican Curia and some of the chaos that's there. And so if someone's never run a major archdiocese, it would be highly unlikely that he would be chosen.
Well, he is both. I mean, one of the amazing things about Ouellet is he is regarded as being an extremely hard worker. He cleared the backup of so many bishops, and he has appointed such good bishops, or rather recommended such good bishops to the Holy Father. Does that make him an ideal candidate?
It makes him a very likable candidate for this office. He has pastoral experience also as a formator of priests. He was a seminary rector. He worked in South America. In Quebec, he met some very difficult situations. For instance, general absolution, which is supposed to be only under specific conditions, was generalized in Quebec. He came and stopped it immediately. There was some opposition to it, but he held firm. Now, he's a man of principle, but he's not a man who is distant from the concerns of the average Catholic.
Rob, he is called, or Bob, I'm sorry, I did it again. He called this job, the job of a pope, a nightmare just a couple of years ago. Is he trying to is he just recognizing the reality of the job, or is that sort of a way to distance himself from it?
Well, who knows? I think it's probably accurate of anybody to say that it's a nightmare to take this job, and he was being candid. And maybe he was also saying, you know, I wouldn't want it, but if it was offered, maybe you know, I would take it. I have to think that he's a strong candidate, though. If the criteria, and I think that Father Landry is exactly right, those criteria, I also think that he needs to be a teacher. We're not going to have a papacy, I don't think. We're not hearing a lot about, you know, new social teaching, new doctrinal developments. But he's going to also have to just be able to convey to people what the faith says, because a lot of our problem in the church is that our own Catholics have not been catechized properly, and that's where the new evangelization comes in. But if you look at it, he knows North America. He taught for 10 years in Colombia in South America, so he's very familiar with all of the Americas. He's been here in Rome, and as I like to say, he's been in the Curia, but not too much in the Curia.
Not in the Curia, but not of the Curia.
Right. So he knows that, and from what we hear, and we've talked about this, of course, off camera, he had to put in some very difficult new bishops in difficult circumstances in Canada. And I think in the United States, we're almost all unanimous. The recent appointments have just been terrific coming out of the Congregation for Bishops, and he's got to have the respect for having done that.
Now, Father Landry, you studied under Cardinal Ouellet, yes?
I did.
Tell us about that experience.
I had 5 courses with him in one seminar. He was a tremendous teacher, working very hard because he was also a consultant to these various Vatican congregations. So he was always 1 or 2 classes ahead of us. But when he would come on in, even though he was teaching things for the first time, his lectures were absolute masterpieces. So even working at the 11th hour, the quality of what he was giving us, synthesizing so many of the great theologians, but also theologians we had never heard of, and putting it into a coherent whole is something that I think, in response to what Bob was saying earlier, would make him a tremendous catechist of the treasures that John Paul II, Pope Benedict XVI, and the popes before him have bequeathed us.
There's a nice continuity here. He was very close to Cardinal Ratzinger, involved in that Communio magazine that Ratzinger co-founded. So there again, like our next papabile, there's a little connective tissue between Cardinal Ouellet and the previous pope. Up next, Cardinal Angelo Scola. The 71-year-old Scola is the Archbishop of Milan. He's a renowned theologian, a protege of Benedict XVI. He was rector of the Lateran University here in Rome, and has in recent years been very involved in the Catholic-Muslim dialogue. Now, I spoke to him about that dialogue in an interview. Here's a little bit of our conversation. Part of the challenge facing Europe, facing America, is integrating and getting along with and finding common bonds with our Islamic brethren here. But this question of violence, Your Eminence, how do you get past it when so many, the young, are listening to the more radical voices?
The problem is the following. Violence is not coming from the religion, but is coming from the religion we enter, the ideology which enter into the religion. Ideology, that means cultural and political perspective in order to build up a civil society. So, these 2 problems. Look carefully to the different Islam, first one. A secondary, don't attribute to the religion what we must attribute to the ideology. This situation will really take some decade in order to be overcome. We have to move step by step with courage, but also with patience. And we have to show the beautiful of the human experience illuminated by Jesus Christ.
Cardinal Angelo Scola there, so on the forefront of this Catholic-Muslim dialogue. Is this an important bit of experience for the next Pope to have, considering the looming threat in some areas of Islam and the growth of Islam throughout the world?
I think absolutely. We know that today during the General Congregation that Islam was discussed. We know that an African cardinal brought it up and spoke in rather frank terms, as the reports say. And I think Scola is a man, he's obviously a brilliant intelligence, and he's in that line of Ratzinger and the others that we've been talking about. He's a brilliant intelligence, but I think also he's very deft in the way that he approaches that dialogue. It's a true dialogue. It isn't trying to smooth over the obvious differences that exist. And from everything that I hear about him, I've lived in Washington for 30 years, and I practice a certain strange type of epistemology. And when I don't know a person personally, if a person that I do know and I esteem says he's good, I tend to think that he's good. And across the board, people I know who I think very highly of, Rocco Buttiglione spoke very highly of Scola yesterday. They uniformly think of him as a interesting pastor and a strong figure.
Father Gerald Murray, could he be the bridge candidate, looking for a reformer, yet someone who the Italians could support because he's one of their own?
Definitely could fulfill that role. He's not in the Roman Curia, but nonetheless he's a Roman hand. He was here for many years. He is the Archbishop of the most important diocese in Italy after Rome, which is Milan. He's also an internationally known figure. He does have respect from many hierarchies. His background makes him a very likable candidate.
Now, once again, Father Landry, you studied under Cardinal Angelo Scola. What should we know that you didn't share with us yesterday about Scola?
Well, I think his whole outreach to Muslims shows a little bit of his character. Pope Benedict, in his conversation with Muslims, was always trying to get them to focus on the natural law, to get them to focus on morality and cooperating for the good that can be known for reason so that it can buttress faith. Cardinal Scola takes culture very seriously, and that new outreach to Muslims, which was called Oasis out of the Patriarchate of Venice, that was all focused on the cultural expressions that Christians and Muslims can bring together. So he's incorporating a little bit of the whole thrust that John Paul II emphasized, that it's the culture that's the most important thing to unite us.
Now, he taught moral anthropology. How might that shape his thought again and the expression of that thought going forward?
So especially continuing the same line of thought, he wants to look how we behave and the criteria on the basis of which we act. And one of the great bridges that can be made between Catholics and Muslims is precisely over our trying to listen to God's voice and let it be obeyed faithfully in us. And so that's one of the reasons why he can engage in these conversations.
Bob Royal, before we get off of this, I am reading reports and hearing reports that there is an American contingent that supports Angelo Scola and would support him going into this conclave. Now, how much credence we place in that, who knows? Why would the Americans, do you think, be attracted to somebody like Scola? What does that candidacy particularly bring to the table?
Well, I think there's a warmth there, and there's a kind of an openness and an engaging quality. And if there's been a kind of a marker that has, in the past few days, set off the American cardinals from the more Italian curial figures, we know that it's been this willingness that Americans seem to have. We're used to dealing in a difficult media environment, and we're used to engaging people publicly. I get a sense of Scola, I don't know him personally the way Father Landry does, but I get a sense that he is that kind of man.
No, I found him sort of buoyant and fun. I enjoyed, he was really a nice, engaging fellow, aside from being brilliant.
And I think we have to say that all these figures we're talking about are very orthodox. There's no, as Father Landry often says, there doesn't seem to be any dispute about that. So we're looking at other issues.
And here's another papabile, Cardinal Christoph Schönborn, the 68-year-old Archbishop of Vienna. Now, he too is a protege and indeed a former student of Benedict XVI. You see a pattern here. A theologian and editor of the Catechism of the Catholic Church, Schönborn gently put down rebellions of his clergy and addressed a festering sex abuse scandal in Vienna. A polyglot, he speaks eloquently on just about anything. Here he is talking to me about faith and science. What do you hope people get from this book? The average layperson reading this book.
I would take away from our faithful the fear of science. And I would love to take away from some scientists the fear of faith. We have not to be anxious about scientific results. Our moral responsibility is increasing through what we know. The more we know, the greater is our responsibility. But never science should be frightening, frightening for faith. But on the other side, a true scientist knows that he knows very little. And he knows that the little he knows, he is in debt to somebody or somebody who is infinitely greater than our understanding. And this can lead to a true conversion.
We often hear of Cardinal Schönborn that he dealt with a very difficult situation in Vienna, and he had a priest rebellion, and they liked the gentle way he dealt with it. He didn't come down like a hammer, but he dealt with it. Does that endear him to these cardinal electors?
Well, it depends who you talk to. Some think that it does, some think that it doesn't. He's of course, a very lordly man. He comes from one of the noble families of Austria.
Right.
I think one of his uncles was already a cardinal.
Yes.
There's something like 18 bishops in the family tree. There's never been a pope, and then there are other religious vocations, nuns, priests, and whatnot. And he just has this noble manner about him. I was at a conference that he put together in Vienna a few years ago, and he's just masterly in the way he kind of moves through a room. But whether the way he handles things, and he's still got this rebelliousness. Some people look upon that as weakness. I don't think that's quite, he's not a weak man. I don't think that's quite the way to look at it.
He was also willing to call out, you will remember, and we're not reporting anything that hasn't been in the public domain. He publicly called out Cardinal Angelo Sodano, who's the dean of the cardinals.
In the infamous case.
Yeah, because of failings to address some of these sexual abuse cases here in Rome. And it was Cardinal Ratzinger who wanted to move on these cases. Sodano did not want to move on them. In a famous moment, Schönborn called him out publicly in what he thought was a off-the-record journalist discussion. And a lot of people look at that now, in hindsight, and say, he could be a reformer. This could be the guy we were talking about, or need.
There was the famous case of Cardinal Brewer, who was accused of sexual abuse of seminarians, and he denied it. And the Austrian bishops consulted and were not in agreement on it. Cardinal Schönborn was right. He was insistent that this man needed to be disciplined, which is in fact what happened. No, I remember Cardinal Schönborn particularly for the Catechism of the Catholic Church. He was the general editor. I had the privilege in 1992 of meeting him to discuss the the English language translation. Monsignor Michael Wren from New York, one of my great mentors, has sent me to Vienna to talk about it. And he was very responsive to the concerns we had that a poor translation would inhibit the effectiveness of the Catechism. He can take on challenges. The question is, of course, what challenges will the next pontiff face? And the man is what we're judging.
He's also a Dominican, which we shouldn't overlook. And many say he's got a kindly, gentle air, and perhaps this is what we need in a pope. Your thoughts?
Well, the Dominicans have always sought truth. But he was also a student of Hans Urs von Balthasar, for whom beauty is the most important criterion. And if you listen carefully to Pope Benedict over the last 8 years of his pontificate, what he wanted to bring to the church and through the church to the whole world was this connection between truth and beauty. And in my opinion, nobody makes that connection better than Christoph Schönborn. Just listen into this little segment as he was explaining something somewhat difficult in terms that everyone can understand, but at the same time there was just a beauty to the way he expressed it, the simplicity that he used, and that's his great strength, which we see throughout the pages of the Catechism. And anybody who's ever heard him lecture say that he just exudes
Well, at the last synod here on the new evangelization, he was one of the 2 or 3 standouts, and many people were talking about him when it was over. Now, during this pre-conclave period, the names of a few Americans have been emerging in conversations. First, Cardinal Sean O'Malley of Boston. The Capuchin Archbishop can often be seen wearing his brown habit. He's credited with cleaning up the sex abuse scandal in Boston and is known as a gentle teacher of the faith. Cardinal O'Malley and I talked recently about attempts to pass a euthanasia bill in his state of Massachusetts. He also addressed the threats to religious freedom. What would you recommend to not only Catholic institutions, Catholic small business people grappling with this HHS mandate? Should they resist it?
Well, I think all of us need to become more informed on what the issues are and to stand together to resist what is happening and to make sure that our legislators and people in government understand what the issues are and what the consequences are. Because I think a lot of people are sort of have been lulled into a false sense of security and not realizing the dangers that are out there for us. But as I say, there's also a spiritual element of this, you know. Some demons are cast out only by prayer and fasting. And
it's time to fast,
and
right?
I think it's time to pray very hard and to work very hard, to stand together as a church, to be proud of our faith and of the great service that we have provided to this country and that we wish to continue to provide.
Cardinal Sean O'Malley. Rob, does he have, I did it again, Bob, his wife is going to start throwing darts at my image at home because I keep calling him Rob. Bob, does Cardinal O'Malley have the reform sensibility that these men seem to be looking for in the next pope to clean up this Curia?
He's a very attractive man. He's got the languages. I think he would convey holiness and you know, personal commitment. He'd be a great teacher. He obviously was considered to be very reliable. He was put into a very tough archdiocese.
Too
lost
tough,
it.
yeah.
I mean, he's a guy who's faced these challenges. I just don't know. It seems to me that we've had popes like this in the past who, by the example of their holiness, sort of radiated out a reform message. He's probably not a reformer in the immediate sense that most people would think of that term, but he may be.
He said that Cardinal O'Malley this week was quoted as saying the church needs a pastor who reaches out to the universal church. Do you see that in Sean O'Malley?
I've seen that for many years. I remember that when he was in Washington as a priest and he was working the Hispanic apostolate, and my first pastor was a Cuban priest in New York, Monsignor Raul del Valle, and he told me about you know, Father O'Malley down in Washington, what a good job he was doing.
Started the Spanish paper there.
Yes, exactly, and this is a man whose interest in Latin America is so significant that he's widely recognized in Latin America as the principal spokesman for the American church down there. His effect, therefore, in uniting the two Americas is great. I think that spirit, if he were elected Pope, would be very evident in how he dealt with many countries.
The rumors swirling around here in Rome, Father Landry, is that the Hispanic bloc might very well swing, if it swings to an American, to Cardinal O'Malley. Now, you've been near him, you know him, your thoughts?
He's the reason why I'm a priest. He ordained me a priest during his 10 years as a bishop in Fall River, and I have to say I'm totally unobjective with regard to him. I love the man as a spiritual father. But he spent a lot of time for the Vatican going into South America trying to fix their seminaries, which were inundated with this liberation theology, this pseudo-Christian Marxism. And he helped to clean that up. He helped to keep Bolivia pro-life. And I would say, in terms of the question you'd asked with regard to the reform, he tries to get to the roots of the reform. As a Franciscan, he tries to act on what Jesus said from the cross of St. Damiano to St. Francis, Cardinal Sean, spiritual father, rebuild my church. And that's the type of reform on the living stones of holy men, women, boys, and girls that he tries to bring about.
His personal holiness is obvious. I've seen it. I don't want to go into the whole stories, but I I've seen it myself, and he's very impressive. He's also, incidentally, the first cardinal to have a blog, which will mean a lot going into this conclave. And finally, the Cardinal Archbishop of New York, Timothy Dolan, is generating some buzz here in Rome. He only received the red hat last year, but as president of the U.S. Bishops' Conference, he is the undisputed spokesman of the American bishops, at ease before the cameras and one-on-one. To give you a sense of what I mean, here's a bit of my conversation with Cardinal Dolan from not long ago. Looking at your long career here in the church and your vocation and how it's played out, you were at the nunciature in Washington. You mentioned that a moment ago. You were also the rector of the North American College, an auxiliary in St. Louis, then an archbishop in Milwaukee. How do you see all of those experiences as preparing you for this moment?
Well, get this. I don't know if you'll find this startling or not. I would find none of those experiences as normative. None of them were as normative as being a parish priest. I had 9 happy years as a parish priest in 3 different parish assignments. About a month ago, I was home, Raymond, and I was visiting my brother Patrick, who married Mary Teresa Kelly, and they have 3 beautiful little kids, Gracie, Kathleen, and baby Pat. And I was taking the 3 of them for a little walk in the neighborhood. Now, here's my point. They live in the parish, one of the parishes where I was assigned. They are on the block where Little Flower Parish is in Richmond Heights, Missouri. And as I'm walking the kids past the playground, the school, the convent, the rectory, the beautiful church of Little Flower, I'm thinking to myself, Dolan, these were happy years here when you were associate pastor at Little Flower. And what did you do? Well, you offered Mass every day with the folks. You tried to prepare your homilies. You visited the sick. You tried to keep the buildings going and the budget balanced. You tried to raise enough money for the mission of the parish. You taught in the school. You tried to bring back those who were alienated from the church. You tried to encourage vocations. You tried to be good to the poor and encourage your people to be that way. You tried to stand up for the message of the church. And I said, I'll be darned. That's the same thing I'm doing as Archbishop of New York. I'm still a parish priest. A little bit bigger, a few more people than, say, the 750 families that were in Little Flower. But I mean that, Raymond.
You know, say what you want about Cardinal Timothy Dolan. The man knows how to tell a story, and he paints a picture like nobody. Bob Royal, what do you think?
If one may apply the term to one of the porporati, as they say here in Italian, one of the cardinals who wear purple, he's an American original. There's no question, and there's no question he's caught the imagination of people here in Italy and in Rome and in the Vatican in particular. It's too bad that he doesn't have the languages, because I think that one of the necessities for the reformer is going to be he has to be able to give close oversight to the Curia. And since Italian is effectively the business language here, that would be a weakness. But man, he brings a lot to everything he does.
There's nobody like him. And the Italians and everybody I talk to, they love Dolan. They say, where are you from? I said, I'm from the United States. Cardinal Dolan. I said, yes, Cardinal Dolan. Now, you're, of course, in the Archdiocese. I know you know him well. Your thoughts on the way that he's captured the imagination here, particularly at that last not conclave, the last synod.
Last synod. Yeah, that was something was remarkable. He is unlike most European bishops, and unlike most American bishops. He is so confident in front of cameras. He knows how to tell a story, but he's not watering down the faith to make it into a fairy tale and make himself look good. No, he presents the gospel of Jesus Christ. He knows he's going to challenge people, but on the same time, he tries to challenge them in a way that they won't reject it. He's a very effective preacher. He's very well loved.
Yeah, I always say, if you read the scriptures really closely, Jesus is pretty funny, and so is Cardinal Dolan. I want to get to some questions, Father Landry. I'm sorry to cut you off on Cardinal Dolan, but this is a question from Jade in Wyoming. I'd like to know more about what happens between the votes once the conclave convenes. Are there more general congregation-type get-togethers, meet and greets, or are the cardinals free to move move among themselves, learning more about the cardinals and obviously praying and discerning.
So there are no more general congregations. In between the votes in the morning, if someone's not elected in the first vote, they go immediately into the second, but then they break for lunch, and at that time they'll have the conversations, same thing at night.
Okay.
So no general congregations, but conversations will continue between the two pairs of votes each day.
Now this comes from Pastor Jeff Short. He is a Baptist pastor, and he writes, "Hello Raymond, I'm a Baptist pastor from New York. I'd like to know and raise the possibility that the council might ask Benedict XVI to reconsider, perhaps come back as Pope with a new understanding that he doesn't have to travel or carry out heavy schedules." Bob?
I don't know if I even want to touch that one. I mean, it's a wonderful idea, and actually, I think people start to say that right away. They should re-elect him and force him.
So we can get home early.
Yeah. But I think it's very, very unlikely. Yeah. It's an interesting idea, and in fact, many people have been talking about, is it really the case that the modern papacy has to be a person who can travel and be sort of a rock star the way John Paul II was? And Benedict actually was very effective in a much more quiet way. But I don't think we're going to see that happen.
A very quick question before we go out. I'll offer it to either of the priests. Can you tell us the difference between cardinal, deacon, cardinal bishop, and cardinal priest? These are various classifications. Do you want to take it, or?
Sure. The cardinals were originally priests and deacons of Rome, and they were assigned to different churches and diaconias. So we had cardinal deacons, cardinal priests, and then we had the bishops of the suburicarian diocese. The diocese, yeah, it's an old Latin word in English, but it means the diocese that were immediately contiguous or touching Rome, and those bishops were called cardinals. So you have the three orders of cardinals, but they're all bishops now.
Very interesting. Before we go, remember my Rome diary can be found at RaymondArroyo.com, as well as on the Seen and Unseen blog at EWTN.com. Each day I bring you the unvarnished insider take on these important days in Rome. That is all the time we have. Remember, join us Monday at 2 p.m. and 9 p.m. Eastern for more. We'll continue to bring you the most authoritative and in-depth coverage of this conclave you'll find anywhere. The show always continues on Facebook and Twitter. Go to RaymondArroyo.com. The Twitter and Facebook pages are linked on the left-hand side of the site. And we continue to take your questions, and we'll try to answer them in the days ahead at conclave@EWTN.com. On behalf of Father Landry, Father Murray, Bob Royal, and the entire staff and crew of EWTN News, I'm Raymond Arroyo. Buonasera from Rome. Ciao. Bob's going to become the running gag at Rome.
And there you have it, our latest edition of Live from the Vatican with Raymond Arroyo and his team. Just a reminder that the conclave has been set and begins Tuesday, March 12th. That's this Tuesday. And of course, it'll start things off with the Holy Mass for the election of the Supreme Pontiff. That should be now on Tuesday morning. And also then there's the procession of the cardinal electors to the Sistine Chapel, which will happen locally in Rome time in the afternoon. If you want exact air times, check out EWTN.com for all that information. And of course, every day we have Colleen Carroll Campbell and her team with EWTN's Vatican Daily. Each day, 9 a.m. Eastern, encoring at 5 p.m. You can look for that. And on radio, you can listen for EWTN Radio live from the Eternal City with Tom Price each day at 10 a.m. Eastern. And look for Rome Dispatch. It returns with Joan Lewis, and that's coming up on Sunday, 11 a.m. Okay, you look for that with Joan Lewis, encoring at 9 p.m. Rome Dispatch with Joan Lewis. And just a reminder, check out EWTN.com for all the latest scheduling information. Stay with us for the most complete coverage anywhere on the Interregnum and the Conclave.